Judith Orr. I work at Bookmarks Bookshop that you may already have visited upstairs, and I'm here to chair the meeting this morning. It's in the course Latin America in Revolt, and our speaker today is Mike Gonzalez, who will be speaking on Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution. Mike is the author of the just newly published book on Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution, published by Bookmarks, which will be on sale at the end of the meeting down at the front. And I urge people to read it. It really is an excellent book, which is really a unique critique and analysis of Che Guevara and his role and how people look to him today. Mike will be speaking for about 35 minutes, and then we'll open up to the floor to contributions. We'll have speaker slips. Team members will be going around with the speaker slips, and if you'd like to fill those in and put them in, we'll call you. We'll have contributions of 3 minutes, but I'll explain that when we start in terms of that. So please give Mike Gonzalez a warm welcome. Thank you.
I like this new habit where you get applauded beforehand. You used to have to earn it. I thought maybe the room would be full of Che Guevara T-shirts, but thankfully there's at least one comrade, thank you, who's come with one. I won't make you stand up. But, comrades, we're socialists. We don't have saints. We don't worship at shrines. I think it's very important to begin by saying that, but we do have symbols of our movement. We do have the signs, the markers of our history, of our past, of the experiences of the movement which inform where we go from here. Che Guevara, for me, belongs absolutely firmly among the signs and symbols of our history and our past. And the difference for me is that an icon, a religious symbol, a saint, urges us to fall on our knees, to worship, and as it were, to surrender our capacity to act, our understanding, our consciousness, to some other force outside ourselves that will act on our behalf. If that is the function of an icon, then Che is not and should not be an icon. If, on the other hand, is the function of a symbol like Che Guevara is to inspire and inform, to educate us about our own history, our own past, to lead us to go back over our own experiences and understandings, and to find there lessons for our own immediate future, for the tasks and the struggles to come, then Che is not only a symbol, but an incredibly valuable symbol. But I begin then by saying we don't worship at the shrine of Che. We recognize and acknowledge what there is in Che's life and Che's experience and Che's brief intervention in the political world to inform and help us in the struggles to come. Of course, if any of you read Sean O'Hagan's poisonous double-page spread in the, well, it wasn't a spread, it was 2 pages in the Observer on Sunday, entitled "Not Just a Pretty Face," it is, well, inevitably, I suppose, it quotes Christopher Hitchens, who's now become everybody's favorite renegade, everybody's favorite man who turned to the right after a briefly misspent youth. In fact, he came up yesterday in Tariq Ali's imperialism meeting, and somebody asked, what happened to Christopher Hitchens? And Tariq answered as I would and say, well, he turned, didn't he? End of story. Christopher Hitchens on the other side, and therefore we should discard his and all the other people that are quoted in Sean O'Hagan's article to indicate that Che Guevara is an empty brand. Well, of course, there are those, from Ricky Gervais and Madonna to the endless series of commodity makers, who have tried to turn Che Guevara into an empty brand. Of course, it's always been so. It's not the first time or the last. After all, in 1789, there were street sellers selling models of the guillotine to cut bread rolls and onions. Of course, there will be people always who try to take our symbols from us, who try to take our markers from us, our heroes, our leaders, our great strugglers, and turn them into empty brands. And yet, the thing that strikes me very much is, although we live, according to some anyway, in a society of a vocabulary of brands, as the anti-capitalist movement rises after 1999, after Seattle, and spreads across the world, as more and more young comrades new to the movement, older comrades returning to the movement, revolutionaries, socialists, rebels, and resistors come into the streets across the world, I notice that they, by and large, do not carry the Nike tick, or pictures of Jimi Hendrix, or Andy Warhol's soup cans. They have chosen, in their overwhelming majority, to use a particular symbol which has become a universal language of resistance and struggle, and that is the face of Che, the face there that the comrade is wearing on his T-shirt. It's an active symbol. It's a symbol not to worship at, but a symbol that says something, to me anyway, very important about why people have come onto the streets. In some way or another, Che Guevara, for a generation of people who almost certainly in their vast majority were not around when Che Guevara died 35 or 37 years ago, have nevertheless found, rediscovered and adopted that symbol as an indicator, as a sign of their rebelliousness, as a sign of their resistance, as a sign of their hatred for the system, as a sign of their determination to fight back. So this book and this meeting is directed at such people, not those for whom Che Guevara is a nice picture on a cup, if any there are. Not for those who O'Hagan and his like sneer at and pour their contempt over as people who can't distinguish between Che Guevara and a Nike tick, but instead to say that we know that when people go and wear their Che Guevara T-shirt, they don't, by and large, wear it to sit and watch the television. They wear it when they go out to demonstrate. They wear it when they go out into the streets to announce their rebellion, their resistance, their scorn for capitalism. And it's with that in mind, and that's, in a sense, it's that content, it's that meaning of Che Guevara that we can resume today. And I think, although people very easily seem to imagine that Che Guevara is an image that's been there forever, actually there were long periods when the image of Che Guevara virtually disappeared, not from the tourist markets here and there, particularly in Cuba, but by and large that symbol was not everywhere. It was not the universal language of rebellion for a very long time. It was in the generation of '68, and of course even then it was commodified. There was a boutique in Kensington High Street called Che, which had Che pictures on the windows, but didn't sell revolutionary manuals or books from the history of our movement, but sold very, very expensive couture dresses, designer clothes, and so on. So even then it was commodified, but just as it exemplified in some way that spirit of the 60s, the spirit which I think most fundamentally and most importantly had begun with a critique of those who had up till then had called themselves socialists, had begun with an attempt to rediscover a different Marxist tradition, a different revolutionary tradition, which was about mass and collective action, which was about the spirit of transformation, which was not about grey bureaucracies imposing terrible conditions on their own workers in the name of liberty and socialism, but was a bitter critique of that. And in the 60s, Che Guevara exemplified that refusal to accept that socialism would mean only hardship, oppression, in the name of socialism, terrible tyrannies persisting in Eastern Europe. A new generation found Guevara at the same time as it began to criticize and to question and to challenge that version of socialism. And I think in many ways the same thing is happening again. The image of Che Guevara, I believe, comrades will tell me if I'm wrong, but I believe exemplifies not only simply rebellion and resistance, but the belief, the hope, the yearning for, and the determination to build a different, better, more joyful, more hopeful world. And that's the way we begin from. But we also, in a sense, have to recognize that Guevara, ironically enough, both exemplified some of that revolutionary spirit in a quite extraordinary way, but also his life yields up other lessons for us. So if we turn back to the life and the real experience of Che Guevara, it's in the spirit of, if you like, in the spirit of the search for symbols and signs, not in the search for an icon, for saints to worship. We want to understand this life, understand this human being, understand how Guevara came to politics, understand the errors and shortcomings that exemplified his life and that occurred throughout. Understand that life as a source of important lessons and understandings for us of every sort. So we're not here to worship, but to understand, to recognize, to celebrate what was fine, and to acknowledge what was absent, what was wrong, what was misguided, because all of that is part of our experience. All of that is part of our history. All of that is what we can learn from the life of Che Guevara. In a couple of weeks, a film's coming out based on the Motorcycle Diaries. I haven't seen the film. I've seen Walter Sallis's previous films, Central Station, being A City of Gone, being the two of them, and they're wonderful films. I don't know what's going to happen, but I have a suspicion that this will be the Che Guevara beatnik, the Che Guevara traveler, the Che Guevara romantic lover, the Che Guevara shiny-eyed standing atop mountains looking to the sky. I don't know. But the Motorcycle Diaries, either it will be that, or they will distort and change those Motorcycle Diaries into something with not. You see, Che Guevara, born in Argentina in 1929, was a young man who grew up in a middle-class family, a family his father was a businessman whose enterprises regularly failed. His mother was an independent woman, a strong woman, who had a series of connections and contacts with Argentine communists. It's important, I don't want to go into it in too much detail, though comrades will raise it if they'd like to, but this is a period in which Guevara was growing up, in which Juan Domingo Perón came to occupy an important place in Argentine politics. Now, the reason I mention it is not simply out of an academic interest, but because there are two important things to be drawn from that. Number one, that Guevara grew up in a family of communists who were bitterly hostile to Perón. And what they saw Perón doing was mobilizing a mass movement of workers, manipulating them in populist terms. And so, although his parents were interested in communism, their version of communism was peculiar. Not only was it deeply Stalinist, deeply rigid and elitist, but it was also a communism that survived in a country where there was a great mass movement of workers of which they were deeply suspicious. So Guevara, who grew up really an asthmatic, very anxious, it seems. I don't want to make, some people make an enormous point of this, but what is important is he engaged in a lot of physical activity. He was an enthusiastic rugby player, in a sense, growing up like any normal young man in a family like this with some politics in the background. But however much we would like to repaint his life and history, the truth is, as a young man, he was not particularly political. He was more interested in sport and women than he was in politics. He was even present at one of the most important demonstrations in Buenos Aires in 1946 during the Perón period, and his friend who was there with him said that Che wasn't interested and went off somewhere else, and he couldn't engage him, he couldn't interest him at all in what was going on in the street. He got snarled up in the demonstration, but actually he was on his way to play rugby. Now, that's not to undermine Che Guevara. It's to say that Che Guevara is not a god, he's not a saint, he's not somebody who woke up in the cradle and said, I think I'm probably a Marxist-Leninist mummy, but somebody who grew to politics in real circumstances, which both explained the nature of his political consciousness and its limitations. So when he embarked on this ride around Latin America, he is not a Marxist leaping on a motorbike to prepare the revolution, but a young man undertaking an adventure across Latin America on his motorbike, going a motorbike which appeared to break down every 5 minutes or so, but he then found other motorbikes and continued. The one thing we can say, though, is that as a Latin American, very early on and very young, and there's a point where he goes up to the great Inca city of Machu Picchu, the place really of the last great Inca resistance, the Spanish conquest. And as he stands there, he feels like most Latin Americans would, a real deep sense of the extent to which his continent, his society has been shaped and distorted by the influence of the United States. He understands in the sense that there is here in Machu Picchu a non-colonial identity which he can understand, identify with, feel as a Latin American. So we can say, yes, as an anti-imperialist, that is embedded in the experience of any Latin American who sees their history shaped, rewritten by colonial powers, be they Spanish or later the powers of the Colossus of the North. But it's really on his second journey, and we can say that in a sense the process leads him as a young medical student who goes for the second time on his motorbike on his journeys, and now as a young doctor. And he encounters, first of all, a series of leper colonies and understands, if you like, the suffering and pain, the poverty and privation that people feel, an instinctive, a sense of solidarity with such people as a doctor, an anxiety to find cures. Much of what he writes at first are not political documents, but papers around questions of the search for cures for leprosy and other jungle diseases. But it's really when he gets to Guatemala in 1954 that is a turning point. And again, this is not so much a history lesson, but Guatemala is a hugely important moment in the whole history of Latin America. Why? Well, because a reforming government had been elected 4 years before under a man called Jacobo Arbenz, a young military officer, a reforming officer, a kind of Chavez figure, if you like, although maybe that's too provocative an analogy. But he had been elected with a program of reform, of nationalization of the land, of recognition of trade unions, of an attempt to develop the economy. But unfortunately for Arbenz, he lives in a country, Guatemala, very much of which was owned by a company called the United Fruit Company. Really an internal battle inside the 26th of July movement between the idea that a revolutionary movement is built among the workers and among the mass movements in the cities, and others, among them Guevara and Castro, who believe that really the core, the heart, the leadership of a revolutionary movement is the core of revolutionaries fighting a military battle, fighting a guerrilla war out of the mountains. And in a sense, that struggle, that political argument is won definitively by those in the mountains. It's won because of the failed general strike in a couple of cities in '58. It's won because, in a sense, the command structure that's imposed on 26th of July movement, the idea of a hierarchy whose main tasks are military tasks, whose language is military language, whose understanding of the success or failure of a revolutionary movement is about the success or failure, if you like, of the efficiency of its methods. That is the argument which definitively wins. Castro represents that idea, the idea that a revolution is made by a core of revolutionaries and the task of the mass movement is to support the actions of the revolutionaries. Now that is a theory of revolution. It's an understanding of how revolution is made. And it is one which, whether we like it or not, marginalizes or reduces to a role of support, or almost of spectatorship, the vast mass movement. It is a different understanding of how revolutions are made. This is not to undermine or to for a single second deny the spirit which moves Che Guevara as an individual. He is everybody who works with him comments on his resolution, his determination, his self-sacrifice, his marginalizing of his own personal interests, his absolute belief that the world must be changed and changed rapidly, his detestation and rage at the actions of empires, of imperialism, and of capitalism itself. Because now Che Guevara, the traveler, the rebel, the resistor, is beginning to read and increasingly see himself as a Marxist. And yet his Marxism does not embrace that other tradition in which we stand. The idea that revolution is the act of the mass of workers themselves, in which they change both themselves and the world. And that's absolutely fundamental. So at the heart of Che's method are two things: the absolute conviction, determination, and selflessness of the revolutionary on the one hand, but on the other hand, and he repeats it in a postscript that he writes later to guerrilla warfare, the idea, as he puts it, we can take shortcuts. And what he means by shortcuts is that the actions of revolutionaries, in the absence of a mass movement, can nevertheless carry the revolutionary tasks forward. So when the revolution comes to power in 1959, when Castro and Che and Camilo Cienfuegos lead in the revolutionary columns, although actually, significantly enough, interpreted how you like, Che does not lead in the revolutionary column. He is sent ahead really to prepare the security apparatus of the new state, which he does remorselessly and ruthlessly. Camilo Cienfuegos leads in the column, and 8 days later, in a triumphant march to the capital, Castro arrives really to assume power. Not directly for another 6 months, but the revolution is triumphant. Batista, meanwhile, has abandoned his New Year's Eve party guests and disappeared to the Dominican Republic and the safety of the embrace of another military dictator, Trujillo, taking with him as much of the national treasury as he could cram into his pockets. So now Castro is in power. But what is he? What are his declarations? What is his political position? And what is Che's? Well, Castro's position is defined by a document, by a speech he made some years before in the trial after the failed attack on the Moncada barracks. It's called "History Will Absolve Me," and it is a defiant, adamant manifesto of a revolutionary nationalist. It is about the national self-determination of Cuba. It is about anti-imperialism. It is about creating an independent economy and an independent society. In it, he does not mention, not for a moment does he mention socialism or a different kind of form of society. He mentions constantly and returns constantly to the theme of national independence and anti-imperialism. That is the dominant idea at the heart of the Cuban Revolution. Now, do Che and Castro share that? Well, they certainly share many things. They share, first of all, the idea, what in the aftermath of a revolutionary war, what is the implication of the command model, the idea that a revolution is made by the determination of those who lead it, made by revolutionaries themselves. What does that translate into when you govern a state? It translates into a command model for the state. Things are done from above. The command model continues into the construction of a new society. Orders are sent down. The role of the mass movements, the mass organizations, is to fulfill the instructions and the commands from above. That is how both Guevara and Castro understood the meaning and nature of revolution, the meaning and nature of the construction of a revolutionary state. But Che becomes, over the years, and it's too intricate to go into here, but becomes over the years increasingly ill at ease with what he sees as Castro's opportunism, his placing of the interests of the Cuban state and the survival of his role in the Cuban state as a priority. He becomes more and more concerned with another question, which is how a revolution isolated, how it can break out of its isolation. He understands very clearly, as he becomes the director of the National Bank and the Minister of Industry, he becomes very clear, Guevara, that really the fate of Cuba will depend on its ability to break out of its economic dependence on a single product, to break out of the sugar economy, right, to break out of its dependence on a single commodity and on the world market, on which it depends for the sale and distribution of that commodity. Guevara understands clearly that this will determine, at least objectively, ultimately the fate of the Cuban Revolution. The capacity to diversify the economy, the capacity to break out of isolation both economically and politically. Increasingly in those 3 or 4 years, while he is a man known for his day and night commitment to the revolution, for his willingness to work all the hours there are, to sacrifice everything, his own personal life, to put that to one side, to carry the revolution forward. But as he travels around, as he goes to Russia, as he goes to China, there is a deepening unease. On the one hand, he says, how can we achieve this? How can we achieve this great leap forward? Part of him says we do it by a kind of great act of will. And he writes an essay, although it comes a little later, called Socialism and Man in Cuba, in which he argues the idea of a new person, a new man as he calls it, a new person who will work and contribute and give their energy out of a spirit of dedication to the revolution, not for gain, not for profit, but out of spirit, the gain for spirit of the revolution. And that idea becomes, very much identified with Guevara and very common and spread throughout Cuba. But the problem is, of course, and it's the same problem as before, that the if you like, determination is an essential quality for a revolution. But revolutions are not won or lost as the result of the degree of determination and conviction and commitment of individual revolutionaries. The thing is much more profound than that. If, no matter how determined you are, there are material conditions in which you find yourself. Revolutionaries, however much they believe it, cannot substitute themselves for the strength and power of a mass movement and a whole class. In Cuba, yes, there are mass organizations, but all of them are subordinated to the interests of the state, interests which change and shift over time. Che's discontent with that. It would be tempting to kind of write him in as a burgeoning Trotskyist, somebody who began to understand ideas of permanent revolution, the nature of the mass movements, and so on. It isn't so. It doesn't undermine anything we have to say, but it isn't so. What he does is within the framework in which he has grown up, within the existing political environment, Che asks a series of questions which are crucial questions. How do we break out of our isolation? Can you make a revolution in a single country, one small dependent country? Can it make the revolution? Can it transform itself on its own? Or must it find a much wider milieu, a much wider world to work in? Must it harness the forces of other countries and other nations and the wider world and movements beyond? Is it possible by acts of will will, determination, and consciousness to transform the material conditions in which we live. And increasingly, I think, the record of Che's few years in power in Cuba, really just 5 years in power, suggests to us that he becomes increasingly uneasy about those questions because he finds no answers to them. The alternative political tradition, however, is not one with which he makes contact. In a sense, he is still embedded in this idea that we can overcome conditions by acts of will, determination, self-sacrifice, driving forward with resolution, we can overcome those material conditions. And yet, by 1964, he and Castro are increasingly in disagreement. They're increasingly in disagreement because Castro has, in some sense, already, because of during the missile crisis or before it, because of the Bay of Pigs and so on, Castro has increasingly tied the fate of the Cuban Revolution to Russia, to the Soviet Union. And in doing so, has absorbed not only has he absorbed, if you like, its model of development, but also its political understanding, that in a sense, socialism is not about the emancipation of the mass of ordinary people, not about workers' revolution, but in some sense about a particular model of economic planning. That's how Castro has, that's the attitude that Castro has taken, and Guevara is clearly uneasy about this. He says so over and over and over again, that he's deeply uneasy about this idea of being subordinated to the bureaucracies of Eastern Europe, about whom he feels, at the very least, great unease, and towards whom he becomes increasingly critical. What then is Guevara's alternative? What kind of movement can he see to break out, for Cuba to break out of its isolation? How can he see a different political future? Who will be the agent of change if it is not a state in alliance with the Soviet Union? What alternative can he build? And when he leaves Cuba in 64, it is with 65, it is with the idea in mind of seeking another road. The other road he seeks is enshrined in an essay he writes called 1, 2, 3, Many Vietnams. It is an internationalist essay. It says no society, no matter how firm and steely its will, can by itself make revolution. That we exist in an international reality. That capitalism is an international system, our movement must be international too. The internationalism becomes more and more the central idea in Guevara. But it is an internationalism tied to those early ideas about how revolutions are made. It is internationalism on the one hand, build 1, 2, 3, many Vietnams, open a series of fronts of struggle and resistance to imperialism on the one hand. But it's tied to the idea that building the revolution means creating guerrilla armies. He goes to the Congo, he goes later to Bolivia in an attempt to build revolutionary armies. The Congo experience, as I explain in some detail here, is a disastrous experience, and then he goes to Bolivia. Why Bolivia? Well, Bolivia, partly, I think, because Bolivia is kind of at the center of Latin America. The project Guevara always had was to build a Latin American revolution. But I think now that while on the one hand Guevara's life is the life of a committed revolutionary who at every turn sought to find ways to develop the revolution, on the other hand, in order to draw from that life important understandings that can inform what we do now, we also have to understand the other side of that, I think. And the other side of it is this, that he went to Bolivia. Now, Bolivia is a country of tremendous political significance in Latin America. In the Motorcycle Diaries, the second set of Motorcycle Diaries, he passes through Bolivia. And Che mentions, though not with any great concern, he doesn't really spend very much time talking about it, the 1952 revolution in Cuba, in Bolivia, a revolution led by the miners at the heart of the working class movement. In other words, Bolivia is a country which, of all countries, represents both the reality and the possibility of organized workers' resistance transforming itself into a revolutionary movement rooted in the class. If anywhere can show us what strength and power working class movements really have, Bolivia is one such example. So he returns to Bolivia at a time when the miners are once again in struggle, though admittedly in a fairly defensive struggle, but they are once again in struggle. Yet Guevara goes to a different part of Bolivia to found and build a revolutionary, a kind of cell of guerrillas, to build the core of a revolutionary army. In other words, his understanding of what a revolution is and how you make it remains fundamentally the same. His commitment to it is unyielding, but his idea of how a revolution is made remains the same. He goes to Bolivia, and for a year is in Bolivia. The Bolivian diaries, to me, are a tragic memoir. They're a memoir of a great revolutionary lost and adrift. They're a memoir of a great revolutionary trying to build a guerrilla cell a few hundred miles away from where a key actor in the working class movement in Latin America is building its struggle based on a long tradition of worker struggle, where there are real forces, real strength, real powers, and the basis of a real mass movement. And yet he is a few hundred miles away, and his Bolivian diaries barely mention that except in passing. The result, the consequence, is the failure, the catastrophe of Bolivia. And it is a catastrophe. It's a catastrophe for two reasons. A catastrophe because it means the death of an important revolutionary, a young man still, 39 years old, who has been just a few years on the world political scene and yet has had a tremendous influence, and whose changing understanding could inform a movement in which he is already beginning to acquire a tremendous stature, the loss of the revolutionary, on the one hand. On the other hand, too, the Bolivian adventure leads a generation of people in some ways to see revolution, or at least, a generation of Latin Americans have taken Cuba as the model. They've taken the Guevara's model as the model for how to make revolution. A whole generation is dead because they have assumed that the building of small guerrilla organizations is the way to make revolution. Instead, they have failed, they have been crushed. After all, the ruling class learned the lesson of Cuba too. They saw Batista fall. They were not about to let other dictatorships fall at the hands of small guerrilla groups. Guevara's death is a tragedy, and it's a tragedy for him, and it's a tragedy for the movement. And yet, a year later, just a year later, a year after his death, new movements are arising all across the world. It's 1968, and 1968 is in one way or another a movement arising on the basis of a critique of that idea, that old Stalinist idea, and seeking a new understanding of revolution which invokes the power of mass movements. They take Che as their symbol and as their example. And we should celebrate that. They invest it with a spirit of rebellion, resistance, hope, and joy. We should celebrate that. But we should recognize, too, that, in a sense, the symbol of Che Guevara is, on the one hand, a symbol of the spirit of revolution, but it's also a sign of a life in which some of the contradictions and the problems, the issues, the great questions about making revolutions were posed and not answered. If Che didn't answer them, then it's part of our, if you like, our obligation to him, to his life, and to the tradition he represents, or to the spirit he represents, to have that, to have that, if you like, the debate with Che, the debate with the life of Che, to draw from it lessons, both good and lessons about errors, lessons about shortcomings, lessons about what was not possible but is possible today. A postscript. 30 years later, Che Guevara's face appears on every demonstration in the anti-capitalist movement. Demonstrations which are, in their very forms of organization, in their language, in their symbolism, in their ways of organizing the streets, manifestations of a belief in the power of mass action. Che Guevara has been taken to be the symbol of mass action. It is true, of course, that also in Cuba, Che's image appears on hoardings, on buildings, on posters, on public documents, and so on. But let's be very, very clear how and why it is used. For many years, Che's image virtually disappeared in Cuba. If it reappeared in the 1990s, it was because in a period of extreme economic difficulty, the image of Che was once again used as a means of exhorting the population to accept sacrifice, to accept command, to accept the fact that the state was acting and asking the population to accept sacrifice in order to save and defend the state of Castro. But on the other hand, neither originally nor 30 years later was the lesson ever drawn that really the future of any meaningful revolution rests in the hands of the mass movements, that the independent action of the masses is what we mean when we talk about revolution. In Cuba, ironically, the image of Che is used to inhibit, to control, and to restrain mass action. So we have two images of Che. Che as the symbol and representation of a revolution which came to victory in 1959, yet which stood in denial of the tradition that a new movement has found and invested in Che Guevara. That is mass action. Cuba is a state which defends its own survival at the expense of the mass of its own people. Right? Yes, I will. I'm just politely waiting. But for us then, two things must arise out of this moment. The Che Guevara gives us, for a whole new generation, the opportunity to discuss what we mean by revolution. But what we mean by revolution is mass action, the rising, the self-emancipation on the class on the one hand, must also be seen against and in contrast to another concept of revolution, a concept of revolution in which the masses are sidelined, reduced to spectators, in which the mass action is subordinated to the interests of a state. In other words, the command model is not revolution. The command model is a way of inhibiting and restricting revolution. It's a way of holding back the mass of ordinary people from seeing themselves as the agents and the protagonists of revolution. For us, and for those who have picked up the picture of Che in the 1990s and the anti-capitalist movement, let's be absolutely clear. Che is an image of revolution, a revolution which begins with the mass action of people who abandon their passivity, who abandon any kind of command, and take the streets and the future for themselves.
Excuse me. Comrades, could you please sit down? Comrade, will you sit down, please? Okay. Comrades, can you stop clapping a moment so that we can... Would you mind please sitting down, and if you don't want to take part in the discussion, if you insist on disrupting the meeting, because you're disrupting the meeting for the several hundred people who... He is allowed to he's been invited as a speaker to speak. It's up to him what he speaks about, and we have speaker slips. If you want to make a contribution, please put in a speaker slip, and you will be given 3 minutes like everybody else. The first speaker will be Pete Morgan, followed by Dave Vinegar. Comrade, if you insist on disrupting the meeting, I'll have to ask you to leave. It says more about your politics that you want to disrupt the meeting and leave no room for democratic debate than it does.
Excuse me. It's my turn.
Don't start yet. He can talk. The speaker is invited to talk on the subject. He can talk about it. If you would sit down, and please, if you disrupt the meeting again, we'll ask you to leave, okay? Right. Pete will be followed by Dave Vinegar.
Okay. Floor show over.
I will tap the mic at 2 minutes.
See, I think the important thing to say about Che really is that, you use the image of him, and we've used the image of him on the posters here in Socialist Review this month and so on and so forth. Absolutely crucial, really, to look at his life and so on. But the precondition of doing that is you have to have a critical assessment of his politics. If you haven't got a critical assessment of the politics of Che Guevara, then what is the point? What is the point of assessing any movement or any revolutionary in the way they act, unless you assess the politics that they have and whether the politics are correct? And this is the same with any revolutionary, any political person. The fact that their ideas don't come from God, they don't come from up above. Their ideas are shaped from the struggles in which they were in. That was the same for Karl Marx, influenced by the emerging working class movement in the 1830s and 1840s. It's the same with Lenin, in terms of influenced by the Russian proletariat, the same with Trotsky, and so on and so forth. It was the same with Che Guevara. Che Guevara did not pick up Das Kapital at the age of 3 and understand it. He might have picked up and played with it, or God knows, I don't know what. His ideas were influenced by the struggle in which he was involved in, the fact that he, as Mike said, that he travelled around South America with a friend of his on his motorbike. He saw the poverty. He was intellectually, he was trained as a doctor, and he was very much influenced by the poor circumstances in which people lived. He grew up within a radical family who were influenced by the Spanish Revolution, and in that process, his ideas were shaped by his interaction in the world in which he lived. He didn't come with a pure analysis of capitalism and imperialism, and he was very much influenced by the imperial intervention that was taking place by the United States at the time. And so when we look at the life of Che understand the great strengths of the guy, but we also have to understand the political weaknesses of him as well. And the great tragedy, really, if you like, the great tragedy of the life of Che Guevara is that he was killed by US imperialism before the events of 1968. That is the great tragedy, that he did not witness the events of 1968. He didn't see the emergence of the working class movement that took place at the time, and the huge lessons that could be drawn from that, as many revolutionaries and growing revolutionaries did at the time. And he didn't understand the self-emancipation of the working class. And that is a great tragedy, really, if you like, of Che Guevara, not himself as an individual. The CIA killed him. US imperialism killed him, and he couldn't develop the ideas that he was developing at the time as a young man. He didn't understand the self-emancipation of the working class. And the reason why that is important today is because the very events which were taking place then are taking place today within South America. In Ecuador, in Bolivia, in Venezuela, US imperialism is trying to crush the movements there at this very moment in time. And the reason why we have to learn the lessons from Che Guevara, the reasons why we have to learn the lessons that the emancipation of the working class is the act of the working class, is so when the working class fight back as they are doing in South America today, is that we learn from the weaknesses of Che Guevara, we learn from his strengths, but we also learn the basic tenet of Marxism and socialism. That you cannot have socialism unless the working class take power. That you have to build amongst the working class. That it's the working class that is the agent of change. And unfortunately, Che didn't fully appreciate that when he died and when he was killed. And that is the lesson we have to learn from the life of Che Guevara.
Dave Vineker will be followed by Chris Bacardi.
I mean, it's obviously brilliant that so many people are inspired by Che. But I think the idea of having an uncritical acceptance of what he's saying actually doesn't work. And it's not even coherent with itself. I mean, Che wrote in guerrilla warfare, if you're revolutionary, make the revolution. Go up into the hills with a gun and do it. He didn't say, if you're revolutionary, go and take part in meetings and all this sort of stuff. That wasn't what he did. That wasn't how he acted. And so I think the idea of the uncritical Che supporter, you wouldn't be here in the city acting in a mass movement in one way or another. You'd be up in the hills. And I think if we look now, in terms of the anti-capitalist and anti-war movement now, I think Che is incredibly inspiring, but doesn't actually offer models of how to act. When the date, the 15th of February, came up, what do you need to do? In whatever city, whatever country you are, go and link up with trade unions, left groups, anti-capitalists, peace groups, and try and build a movement. What does Che have to say about that? Well, sadly, nothing. If you get 10, 100, or 1,000 or 1,000,000 people in the streets, how do you as a revolutionary relate to those people? They're on the demonstration against the war. We need to talk about imperialism, capitalism, and so on. Che doesn't have anything to say about that. It wasn't what he was about. And so I think we have to say we're inspired by him, but as a model of how to act, he doesn't offer us a model of how to act in a city, in a mass movement. And I certainly don't think he was about shouting people down in meetings. Just one final example. About 5 or 6 years ago, I got involved in a debate with some comrades in Uruguay. In our paper in Barcelona, we had an article about struggles in Colombia, and there was some criticisms about guerrilla politics. And they wrote back a long letter criticizing us, saying that you don't understand, here in Latin America, it's guerrilla politics that really has a strong hold on us. And we had a long debate. It was interesting, but in fact, they weren't in the hills either. They were in Montevideo with a Left magazine. Not because of that debate, because of a whole lot of other things. They eventually agreed with what we're saying is a tendency. They're now building a revolutionary organization in Montevideo. And in fact, the biggest demonstration in Latin America on the 15th of February was in Montevideo, 70,000 people. That works, comrades.
Chris Bacardi will be followed by Miriam Ora.
I want to congratulate Mike Gonzalez on his book. It's an incredibly sophisticated and a manipulative piece of counter-revolutionary propaganda. Actually, what the SWP has done is violated the first principle of Marx himself, historical materialism. The working class played a fundamental and vital role throughout the Cuban Revolution. There was a movement for the release of Fidel Castro and the other survivors of the Moncada barracks. Why? There was a movement that got them released instead of 15 years, but in 2 years. Obviously, the whole of Cuba had a mass movement for their release. This has been written out of the history of Cuba and the revolution. When Frank Pais, the leader of the urban underground movement, who hasn't been mentioned here today, when he was killed, there were 60,000 people spontaneously in the streets at the funeral, and the working class went on strikes for several days until the repression of the dictatorship was so horrific they had to return. That courageous revolutionary history has been written out by Mike Gonzalez and the SWP. There's so much more I could talk about, believe me. I've studied this for years. This book, right, has some scandalous claims, sloppy academic piece of work, if you ask me. For example, in all the years I've studied the revolution, I've never heard the claim that Fidel Castro received money from the CIA. And there's no referencing. So where did he source that information from, if not the CIA himself? No one else is claiming it. Very, very dangerous. Why does the SWP take this position? Well, the only way I can explain it is it fits with their own political strategy in this country, which puts the trade union movement at the heart of any movement in this country. The fact is, working class people were involved in the revolution in Cuba, but the trade unions weren't leading it. Why? Because all of the communists and left-wing leaders had been assassinated in a bloodbath at the end of the 1940s. So the trade union movement was the puppets of the dictatorship. This trade union movement, we can see the tendency towards corruption and co-optation in this trade union movement. Would they lead a revolutionary struggle against the Labour Party? The reality is that what they are talking about is a dogmatic view that if the trade unions itself aren't actually passing motions at union meetings to, take up arms, then the working class themselves, who take up arms, aren't the armed working class. And this is the logic of their position. There is no logic. And actually, we haven't had the delight of hearing Mike Gonzalez's view of the Cuban Revolution, Cuba today, socialism in Cuba. But I have sat through so many Marxism meetings where these people have advertised a website which belongs to the Cuban American National Foundation, the right-wing Miami terrorists. Cuba has a claim in international courts for the lives of 2,800 Cubans murdered by those people. Why is the SWP advertising their website? Why are they still using the same lies? And the last thing I want to say is I had to wear a wig to get into this meeting because last year my comrades were stopped from entering an open, free debate because they knew that we're activists in support of the Cuban Revolution.
Miriam will be followed by Chris Harman.
Can you hold it up, Comrade? I can't read it.
Oh, don't. Just speak. Come on, get on with it. Get on with it.
All right. I'm from the Arab world, and just to explain how the importance of Che and other revolutionaries were for anti-colonial movements and movements or people that have been suffering cruelly and barbarically under imperialism. I mean, the Che's played a very, very important role for the consciousness and for the self-assurance of many millions of people in the Arab world as well. And that's why many, many people have a problem with criticizing these kind of revolutionaries that played an important role for many people in the third world. But actually, as Mike Gonzalez said in his introduction, if the mass movement eventually gets the role of spectators, it can also lead to an enormous alienation of millions of people towards these same revolutionaries. And I don't think that's what we want as well. Because I think that, in a way, we have to admit that Che and the politics he represented weren't the kind of revolutionary socialist politics that many of us here hold up. But still, I think that Che and the image that he represents belongs to us. I don't think he belongs to the left-wing people who have a fetish with Castro or Che, or the music or fashion industry that are actually exploiting images of Che for their own T-shirts and jackets. I think that we have to be critical enough, but at the same time identify with the Seattle and the 15 February generation that is actually holding on Che's image and identifying with the spirit that he was representing, namely the spirit of resistance, anti-capitalism and anti-imperialism. And I think that if we don't do that, we're going to miss the boat in involving these people into our politics. And I think that at the end of the day, to have a critical assessment of Che and the revolution he stands for, at least has to conclude in two important points, which is there is a mistake in equating, I think, Che Guevara with Castro, with what a lot of people are doing. I think that the fact that Che Guevara left Cuba and had a lot of differences with Castro kind of explains it. At the same time, I think it's wrong to equate Che Guevara only with guerrillismo. I think he did stand for a mass movement, and the example of the 1, 2, 3 Vietnams say that. But it doesn't help to just look back at Che in a dogmatic way and criticize all relevant and critical information that is produced about Che in order to help us as a tool for our resistance. I think that we have to introduce him to our movement, and that's why I think that it's very good that the book on Che came out and that the front page of the review has an image of Che, because Che belongs to our movement and we have to take him back as our property and not let these ultra-leftist or fashion industry occupy his image for themselves.
Chris Harman will be followed by Viren Swamy.
See, I just want to take up the question of Cuba, because we have to understand, Che left Cuba, I think 38 years ago, because he could see there was problems of trying to build some sort of better society.
Would you please not interrupt? You've had your say, so let him have his.
He believed it's the difficulties of trying to build some sort of society in isolation from the spread of the revolution. That's the reality he left. 38 years later, you can't just say that somehow Cuba even remained fixed in the way in which Che saw it and saw problems he saw at that point in time. You have to say what actually is the process, the result of the isolation of the Cuban Revolution. And the result is you have something which remains a thorn in the flesh of American imperialism, very, very significant thorn in the flesh of American imperialism. And for that reason, everyone who wants to defend any struggle anywhere in the world has to be adamantly opposed to the US economic embargo against Cuba and any attempt to overthrow the Cuban regime. At the same time, we have to stand inside Cuba. What exists is not anything any of us would like to fight for as the alternative to capitalist society. You just have to read, for instance...
Do you mind not interrupting? You have had your say.
Let me try to explain. Sorry. If you see, you can read...
Comrades, will you please don't heckle or interrupt? Comrades,
let me try to explain. You see, for instance, you can go across Dylan's bookshop and you can buy a book. I don't particularly like the style of the book, by a man called Gutierrez, on Havana, a novel on Havana, 3-part novel on Havana. Gutierrez is someone who's not an exile from Cuba, who's gone back to Cuba, and you can explain what it means to him when his son breaks his arm, and he goes to the hospital, and he's not getting the attention he wants because he cannot afford to bribe the doctor. You can read in there the reality of the old American woman, American revolutionary, who still sings revolutionary songs on her rooftop, but no one listens because no one takes it seriously, because this general feeling that things have not gone, the aims of the revolution have not been achieved, that things have become ossified and sclerotized and so forth. You can ask questions. We don't actually advertise the websites financed by the United States. If you look at the dissident websites from Cuba, they're not left-wing websites, but they have things like statistics about living standards and health care and education facilities. And you have to ask why these banned. Because if we produce statistics in Britain saying all works in Britain work as in the conditions under Charles Dickens, 18 hours a day, huge 30% death rates and so forth, no one would read these things. You actually have to say that somehow they're banned because possibly they say things which the regime doesn't dare to admit to its own people. It's not dared to be honest. If someone stood up and say Che Guevara is elected, actually there's no possibility in Cuba of anyone standing from a socialist position in opposition to Che Guevara. There's no possibility of discussing what the outlines of the plan are each year. And to be honest, when we talk about working class democracy, we talk about a society which working class people who work in the factories and the offices and the docks, in the mines, in the call centres and so forth, are able to discuss freely what these things are, to discuss among themselves, to come to decisions. If that's not what we're talking about, I don't know why we make a revolution. We want to make a revolution precisely to bring that about, and we don't want to bring about the sort of society that used to exist in Eastern Europe, or the sort of society which exists in Cuba today. We defend the Cuban Revolution, but we don't want to imitate it.
Okay, the next speaker is Viren Swami, and I'm afraid because of interruptions and delays, Viren will have to be the last speaker. I've got some announcements before I call Mike to sum up. Carry on.
I'm not actually sure what to say now. I think Mike's absolutely right in a way to say that I think we have to reclaim Che Guevara, the revolutionary, the internationalist, the anti-imperialist. But also we have to try and understand that Che was a real, living, breathing human being with a particular historical, social, political background. I think it's absolutely right that we reclaim Che Guevara, the Che Guevara that actually believed, who wrote that we had to stop crying and start fighting, but also the Che Guevara who believed that political struggle was ultimately a military struggle. I think we can reclaim Che Guevara, the internationalist, the anti-imperialist, the guy who believed that you had to spread the revolution, the guy who believed that you couldn't have just one, but you had to have 2, 3, many Vietnams, while still criticising the fact that Che believed that revolutions create revolutions, that a small group of revolutionaries can go off to any place in the world with any set of political understanding and go off and create a revolution regardless of the political, historical or social context. I think, again, we can reclaim the Che Guevara that ultimately gave up his life for revolution. The Che Guevara who believed in the spirit of the Russian Revolution. He wanted to give his son the name Vladimir in recognition of Vladimir Lenin, the revolution from Russia. But I think the contradictions that Mike brings out in his book and in his talk today, I think these are important implications because they have implications of how we organise and how we relate to political parties and things like that today. I mean, I think the only way you can understand why the Zapatistas carried Che on their banners when they marched into Mexico City on the 1st of January 1994 is to understand these contradictions. I think there are two traditions here. I think ultimately there are two traditions. There was a revolution situation in Cuba, but it's not in the 1930s when a general strike and a mass movement in Cuba actually got rid of General Machado. That's the kind of revolution that I wanted, and the revolution in Bolivia that Mike talked about, and not the kind of real isolation that Che actually faced when he was in Bolivia. When in a really moving piece, when he talks about his isolation while there's a mining strike going on in a place called Siglo XX, which is about 200 miles from where he's standing. It's a completely different situation. I think I'll make an admission now. I think when I first got politically active, my first port of call was Che. I read all of Che's books. I actually tried to come to understanding of what he was trying to get out. But I think if we only read Che, we don't actually engage with what's going on in the world today, the big anti-war movements, the anti-capitalist movements, all the rest of it. I think we run the risk of holding a banner in a meeting when everyone's trying to actually have a good debate about it.
Okay, well, there is a host of slips here I couldn't call this morning, so I'm sorry to all of those who put a slip in. And if you would not interrupt, please. You're standing there distracting people who were trying to make their contribution to the meeting. You made your contribution to the meeting. I have two announcements to make before I call back Mike. First of all, Mike will be giving a guided tour of the Edward Hopper exhibition at Tate Modern on Friday after the closing rally. You can get your tickets for that for £8 in the publication stall in Bookmarks. And another one, just to remind people of a change of venue and time on the timetable. Kate Hudson from CND is speaking on Bush and Blair's Weapons of Mass Destruction at 11:45 in Birkbeck. So that's the next session. Kate Hudson will be speaking. And also just to say that Mike Gonzalez's book on Che Guevara and the Cuban Revolution is on sale at the right-hand side of the stage afterwards for those who'd like to buy a copy. Please hand over to Mike. And if there is any heckling during this, we'll have to ask you to leave the meeting because Marxism opens up the floor for debate and open discussion somewhere you will not find in such huge events anywhere else in Britain today. So please respect the speaker and let him have his time to sum up. You've all had your say. Thank you.
You see, comrades, I mean, I wanted to start with the comrade who spoke about Che in the Arab world and say that Che is our symbol. Che belongs to us. Che belongs to us in the same way that all the experiences of revolutionary struggle in the past belong to us. And one of the lessons we learned from it is that in history we have a simple criterion, and that is, how do we judge any political moment? No, it's
People
okay.
stop
Look,
heckling,
it's okay.
please. Be
Leave
quiet,
them there.
everybody.
Leave them
Be
there.
quiet.
I'll be brief. We'll conclude, and then they can wrap up the banner till next year. Okay? There was really no need to wear a wig. All your comrades got in last year and did exactly the same thing, comrade. Okay. Our criterion is very simple. If a revolution is meaningful to us, if it's significant for our movement, it is because it advances the understanding and the capacity of the mass of ordinary people to organize themselves to become the protagonists of their own future. That's a very simple criterion. And therefore I have some difficulties with a model that is offered to us, which is characterized by the denial of any such right, of the right of collective organization, the right of independent representation, the right of independent action, the 45-year endless re-election of the same
Comrades, will
leader.
you please
Stop
be
it,
quiet?
comrades, calma.
Sit down. Will you please be quiet? You've had your say. We've made it clear you've had your say.
Don't.
Let Mike finish his summing up. Would you please accept the democracy of the meeting and let Mike have his summing up?
You see, I'm afraid.
Mike, do you want to continue, please?
Yeah, I do.
Would everybody else
you
please
see, I'm
sit
afraid
down?
what we see here is exactly the problem.
Would everybody
It's
else
exactly the problem.
sit down? Everybody else sit down and listen to this. Just leave it to the team members. Well,
The thing I find very strange is we're not a democratic organization. We're sitting here letting ourselves be yelled at. Socialist, comrade, are never cheerleaders for individuals who proclaim themselves the sole representatives of the revolution. The revolution for us is quite clear. What we are being told here and asked to accept is that for 40 and more years, a single individual represents a revolution, and the repression of the vast majority of Cubans, the reduction of their lives. That you go to Cuba today, for example, and the image of Che is used to justify a situation in which a small minority sails around in Mercedes and SUVs, and the vast majority live in poverty. Now, why? I'll tell you why, comrades. I'll tell you why. Free education exists in a whole series of countries. You can't do that. You know, we are socialists here. We're talking about developing to... All right, comrades, look. There is no point in continuing in this situation. Let me simply say this. We judge every moment by the extent to which it advances or holds back the capacity of the mass of ordinary people to make the revolution themselves. We do not accept substitutes for the class. We do not accept those who name themselves the representatives of the class and then deny to their own working class the right to organize in defense of their own interests. This is an absolute contradiction of what socialism means. Go back. Be a cheerleader for Cuba. We, meanwhile, will try and build out of a living mass movement the possibility of a new and different kind of socialism in which debate, democracy from below will be the central mark.
yeah. The team members, if you open those doors so we can leave by both sides, please. Could team members open this as well? Team members, open the door. You can leave on both sides, comrades. You can get out this side. Cheers. Hannah, if you... Yeah.